Greetings, everyone. I'm Minky Worden from Human Rights Watch. My job is to oversee all of our work on sport and human rights worldwide. I also edited a book on the Beijing Olympics in 2008 and previously lived and worked in Hong Kong. A few housekeeping notes for our press conference today. I want to remind you this session will be recorded. If you have a question, please put it in the chat and we will work to get you answers in the time we have. Feel free to post your questions there, and also remember to introduce yourself, your news organization, and let us know if you're in the Beijing press bubble. On Sunday, February 20th, the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics will close. For this press conference, Human Rights Watch is publishing a new statement on the close of the Olympics. I will put it in the chat. This statement condemns the censorship and atrocity crimes that are a backdrop to these games and documents how athletes, journalists, and the public were intimidated. It also documents how the International Olympic Committee enabled Chinese Communist Party propaganda on an Olympian scale. This week, we also published a letter with the End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition. That's a group of more than 400 NGOs working to end forced labor. We sent the letter to the International Olympic Committee 2 weeks ago. The letter questions the IOC supply chain due diligence, which was published just before the Olympics, and also says that the IOC cannot ensure its ubiquitous tracksuits and thousands of five-ring products made by Chinese companies sourcing in Xinjiang are free from forced labor. Now we turn to our panel of experts to cover the response of athletes, parliaments, sponsors, broadcasters, and affected groups, including people from the Uyghur region of China, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and of course, Chinese human rights defenders. We're going to discuss the end game for the Olympic movement after these games that were a dream for Chinese President Xi Jinping, but a nightmare for human rights. Our speakers today are Sophie Richardson, the China director at Human Rights Watch, Noah Hoffman, a Nordic ski athlete and a 2014 and 2018 Winter Olympian in Sochi and Pyeongchang, also a three-time US national champion. Yacho Wang, the China researcher at Human Rights Watch. Jahar Ilham, who's a Uyghur human rights advocate and a spokesperson for the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region. And Rob Keeler, Director General of Global Athlete, which is an athlete-led advocacy group with many Olympians as members. Our first question to Yacho Wang. Yacho, you have authored the Human Rights Watch statement for the close of the Beijing Olympics that we've just published today, and you were in China for the 2008 Games. What is your assessment of these Olympics for human rights?
Well, we went into the Olympics expecting, censorship, surveillance, just as what we expected happened. But I think even we all know human rights violations in China is terrible. The Chinese government is, belligerent, aggressive, and, don't admit any wrongdoings. Still, I was surprised to see the person who, the last torchbearer, Eileen Gu, she's a Uyghur, and this is like a middle finger to the rest of the world. The government saying, I don't care what you say, I do whatever I want to do. Interestingly, Eileen Gu, after she competed, after her event, she didn't pass through the common area that, the athletes were supposed to meet the journalists. And then she never responded to any requests from non-Chinese state media, but she did do an exclusive interview with the state media expressing how grateful she was. Then even, the state media also showed pictures of her family like clapping and felt so moved by this. So I think this was such a, even for someone who knows how bad a human rights violation is, still to see the government being so brazen. The government is not only committing crimes against humanity, the government is flaunting its atrocities. Then soon the attention, a lot of attention went to Eileen Gu, who was a U.S.-born Chinese athlete who won a gold medal. And there were censorships around her. On the one hand, she posted on Instagram saying, everybody can get a VPN to log on to the free internet. Why, basically saying why it is a big issue, when she was responding to a person who saying, Chinese people cannot access Instagram. Then that screenshots of her response on Instagram was censored on the Chinese internet. At the same time, the Chinese government was also create narrative about her. There's so many propaganda surrounding her. So, she's the image, a person who was born in the United States, who's in a very, very talented athlete, but she chose China to represent China, chose the motherland. In a way, she became a tool of the government to propagate its message, we're better than the United States. So I think this is two big events that kind of caught my attention. I will stop here.
Yeah, thanks very much. And we'll come back, I think, to the topic of censorship as well, which is one of the areas that you write on frequently. And I'd like to go now to Jahar Ilham, because you've also mentioned the torchbearer that I think was a shock for the world, and also a very strong message of really that the Chinese government was using the torch relay to refute satellite images and a lot of documentation of crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. I'm going to put in the chat Human Rights Watch's report documenting crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. And I wanted to ask Jahar, your father has been sentenced to life in prison, is serving life in prison. How did you feel as a Uyghur person about these Olympics?
Thank you, Minky. The reason I raised my hand was because I really wanted to react to what Yashio said earlier about, Uyghur woman was selected to enlighten the torch. And I just really wanted to note that, well, as Yashio mentioned, she was rarely seen again after the lighting up the torch, and she couldn't accept any media interviews like the others. And it seems to me that the Chinese government was just trying to use her to prove that there isn't a genocide happening. There isn't crimes against humanity happening. Uyghurs are just living happily and dancing and singing and lighting up torches in China. And this isn't it historically equivalent to Nazis choosing a Jewish athlete to light the torch back in the 1936 Olympic Games? And this just shows so much resemblance to me, and it made me really uncomfortable. At the same time, it made me even more uncomfortable because this lady, she shares the same last name as me, Lam Jan. It's my father's name in our traditional way of saying it. So we both share several similarities. We're both Uyghur women. We both, doesn't matter what we do, where we are, we're under Chinese government's control. Even though I'm living in the US, I'm still not completely free. I'm still afraid for my safety and my family's safety. She might have given the honor to light up the torch, but she might be under the fear of worrying about her family's safety. Who knows? When her family members are clapping in front of the camera, maybe they're crying, tearing up inside. I just wanted to note that. That's why I raised my hand. Thank you, Minky. Thank you, Yachu, for bringing that up.
And since we have you speaking, I'd also like to ask you about the IOC's handling of its supply chain audit. I know that you've worked on this topic for many years, and I have a very simple question for you. Is it possible to, many, five, major auditors pulled out of the Uyghur region and said it was impossible to audit due to repression. It put a question to you. Is it possible, you're an expert in this area, is it possible to audit a supply chain in the Uyghur region? Is it possible to source uniforms from companies that are based there without an association with forced labor?
Thank you for bringing up this extremely important topic. I wouldn't say myself as an expert, but I have read the statements many times, and the IOC's this recent statement, it was very definitely written as there's no forced labor was involved in the production of uniforms for the Beijing Winter Olympics. They written it as they were so certain. But the due diligence statement that the IOC announced does not apply to the vast majority of Olympic branded goods. It only listed two brands, Hengyuanxiang HYX, and the other one is Anta. And this statement completely ignores the vast majority of Olympic branded goods, and it only applies to these two companies that supply uniforms, and excludes the vast quantities of Olympic branded apparel, and that many dozens of other Olympic partner brands also are involved. And there are also other deep flaws in this IOC's statement about auditing, including extremely weak transparency. There's no disclosure of the names of the factories that make the relevant goods, no disclosure of the names of the auditing firm utilized, and no disclosure of the results of any specific factory audit. What kind of due diligence announcement statement is that? So no details about the factories and production sites visited, and the audit methodology and findings, or the steps taken to ensure that the workers were not subject to retaliation for speaking to auditors or reporting violations, which is a principle for due diligence. And the IOC's statement did not cover any of that. And I really think that it's only going to cause more harm than good by failing to carry out or implement an effective due diligence statement like that. And I don't understand what IOC is trying to prove with such a vague and a statement that has such a weak transparency.
Thanks very much. And I've put both the statement by Human Rights Watch and the End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition, a group of 400 NGOs and experts working on this, in the chat, along with the letter to the IOC, which was sent on January 31. And I wanted to turn now to Noah Hoffman. Noah, you have had an experience as a Winter Olympian. You've experienced two Olympics as an Olympian, and you have. I know you've been monitoring, and I know you're concerned about what athletes have been experiencing in China. And I wanted to read a couple of quotes to you from athletes who have been in China. Swedish speed skater Niels van der Poel won 2 gold medals in Beijing, but he also expressed disappointment on competing in China. He said, "I think it's extremely irresponsible to give to a country that violates human rights as blatantly as the Chinese regime is doing." And then, and he said that after he returned home to Sweden. Freestyle skier Gus Kinworthy, who is still in China, said, "You should make," this is a quote, "you should make sure that the host country are up to a certain level of ethics. And I don't think that China is currently displaying those. So I don't think they're suited to host the games." Noah, do you think the IOC, given that these athletes are speaking out now, and we may hear more after thousands of them return home, do you think the IOC made the right choice for athletes to go to China?
Yeah, thanks, Minky. The IOC definitely made the wrong choice in sending the games to Beijing. And the reason is because when we look back on these games, even when the athletes themselves look back on these games in a year, in 4 years, at the next cycle, in 10 years, we're not going to remember these games for Nils's 2 gold medals. If Gus wins another gold medal on Saturday, we're not going to remember another medal, sorry, on Saturday. We're not going to remember that performance either when we first think about these games. Instead, we're going to remember the things that Yachu and Jahar are talking about. We're going to remember the way that these games were used to bolster two different authoritarian governments, the first being China, and their use of an IOC press conference. I'm sure that most of the reporters on this call saw the press conference yesterday, where they're using an IOC press conference, ostensibly this apolitical venue, to question the sovereignty of Taiwan, to dispute the existence of forced labor in Xinjiang. It's mind-boggling. And we saw the parading around of Peng Shuai to deny allegations of sexual assault. As Yachu mentioned, the censorship of Eileen Gu, stating that her method of getting onto a free internet while in China, the Uyghur torchbearer that Jahar talked so much about. Those are the things that we're going to remember. And then the second one is the continued use of the Olympics by the Russian state through doping to their own political ends. We've been 8 years since Sochi, and still we're talking about Russian doping. That's still the headline of these games. And this games, it comes at the expense of a 15-year-old athlete who is caught up in this system. My heart broke, and I'm sure most of yours did too, watching her skate last night. That's what we're going to remember from these games. And that both of these things, the use of these games by China to cover up human rights violations and to legitimize their power and their appearance on the world stage, and the use of the games through doping by Russia to further their own power and legitimacy through their athletes. All of these are the failure of the International Olympic Committee, the failure of any accountability for global sport administrators, the failure of WADA, CAS, and the IOC to implement real accountability for the first Russian state-sponsored doping scheme in 2014 and everything that's happened since, including manipulation of the LIMS data and all the way through to last night's skating event. And the failure of them to control their own press conferences while in China and to stop them from being used to political ends, the failure to acknowledge a sexual assault allegation from a Chinese athlete. These are the things we're going to remember these games for. And that's why they should never have been awarded to China in the first place. And we need to work together as an international community to make sure that we're never in this position again.
Thanks very much. I'm going to come to Rob Keeler, your Global Athlete colleague and the executive director of Global Athlete. And just reacting, I'd like to ask you to react to what Noah has just said. Olympic, for, as you're aware, for certainly starting, Human Rights Watch began asking the IOC to adopt human rights in 2007. And we did at the Olympic Congress in 2009 and for every Olympic since, right? And as Noah points out, there have been human rights abuses at every Olympics because frankly, every government commits human rights abuses. So you need to have a framework to deal with them. Can you talk for a minute about whether the IOC had the right framework in place to protect athletes from, say, the threats to be silent by Yang Shu, the deputy director of BOCOG, the Beijing Organizing Committee of the Olympic Games? Was there any framework in place that would have helped deal with some of the problems that Noah has enumerated?
I think the simple answer is no. I mean, athletes and athlete groups have been pushing for the IOC to implement and integrate the UN Declaration of Human Rights into the Charter. They did a extensive review, an assessment, and it's sitting on someone's shelf. I mean, I will talk what Noah just raised about Camila Vaviela, the Chinese figure skater. This is more than a doping issue. This is an issue of child abuse. This is an issue where she had a positive sample, and any right sane person, whether in the Olympic movement, you would have told her it's time to go home. Instead, they victimized the victim. They put her back on the ice when the competitors didn't want her there, when the world sport is looking at her as a cheat, and they're asking her to perform. And on top of that, they've said that no one's going to get medals if she should medal. If that's not putting a psychological damage on a young child, I don't know what is. Shame on them, and it should never happen again. A basic right of freedom of expression. We pushed for freedom of expression over and over again, leading into these games. We had the IOC relax the rule. And then we get into China, and what happens is there's threats thrown directly at athletes, both by the Beijing organizing committee, telling athletes, should they express freedom of expression that's against Chinese law, there'll be consequences. The IOC rule clearly states, if you speak against the law of the country, there'll be consequences. The whole idea of an open, transparent, and legal system to hear athletes doesn't exist. The IOC operates a court of arbitration of sport that's not transparent, it's not independent, it's run by the IOC and its vice president. You know, the final thing is where we talk about human rights is the ability for athletes to independently and collectively organize and to have equal representation. The IOC has fought that tooth and nail to avoid athletes gaining power, to avoid athletes having people represent them. And what happens is we have this huge power imbalance that has resulted time and time again. It's not limited to Russia. It's a global problem where there's abuse happening in sport. We've seen it in gymnastics, we've seen it in soccer, we've seen it in so many sports where instead of dealing with it and openly talking about it, where athletes have representatives, everyone wants to stay quiet about it. They don't want to raise it to the forefront, and athletes are afraid because there's a real fear of retribution. And if you can collectively organize and have athletes represent athletes and have someone in their interests, it's a different ballgame. So the answer that's a long answer, Mickey, but the answer very clearly is the IOC has failed athletes globally by not implementing and integrating the UN Declaration of Human Rights into the Charter. It's a shambles, it's a shame, and it should never happen.
Thanks very much. I want to remind journalists we're going to come to you after the next question, and please put your questions in the chat and we'll come to them one by one. I want to go to Sophie Richardson, who's a China director of Human Rights Watch. And Sophie, parliaments, governments, and UN bodies are increasingly demanding accountability for crimes against humanity. I saw that the German Bundestag is holding a hearing for accountability on human rights around the Olympics. Is this a trend? What should the world be looking for after the Beijing Olympics? Has the Chinese government's wolf warrior tactics at these games, has it backfired?
Yeah, I think the way the Chinese government has conducted itself in the last couple of years has certainly driven precisely the kind of responses that Beijing doesn't want. We've obviously watched about 8 or 10 governments participate in a diplomatic boycott. You know, in addition to the Bundestag, there are a couple of different debates going in the US Congress. Just as the games were getting up and running, the Japanese Diet actually published a resolution about the human rights environment in China that was very critical. That was quite unusual. The other interesting diplomatic snub in the opening ceremonies was actually to India, where there's now a somewhat unusual discussion going on about some of these issues too. And you know, it remains to be seen how this is going to crystallize into the kinds of binding legislation that we now see coming online here in the United States in the form of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and some of the due diligence legislation that's going to come online in the European Union. I suspect we may see some more sanctions in the not too distant future against individuals and companies and state entities. But you know, we're very concerned about shifting the attention from Beijing now to the United Nations Human Rights Council session that opens a week after these games finish, and particularly around the issue of whether the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, will finally publish a long-awaited report that her office has put together looking at human rights abuses across the Uyghur region. You know, it's not clear why that report has not yet been released. She started talking about it last September. Her spokespeople reiterated in December that it would be released within just a few weeks. It still hasn't come out. You and if it's possible that UN officials decided to wait until the Olympics were over to publish this report, well, here we are. It's time. Uyghurs should not have to wait a day longer for concrete steps towards investigations and prosecutions for some of the most serious crimes under international human rights law. They've had to wait for too long already. Too many other communities are not being supported or paid the kind of attention that they deserve. And so that is a critical next step to take some of the political momentum around a lot of these different issues, but I think that's been generated or heightened by the games, and drive it forward with a view towards holding the Chinese government accountable the way many other governments are.
Hey, Sophie, just a quick redirect. I couldn't help but notice the UN Secretary General sitting in the stands at the opening ceremony and posing for pictures extensively. What was the UN Secretary General doing at the Beijing Olympics, taking place in a context of active crimes against humanity, while, as you suggest, the report that we've been waiting for years was put in a suitcase? What is your analysis of how the UN has managed these Olympics?
Well, I mean, he's been very weak, not just on crimes against humanity targeting Uyghurs, but really on China issues broadly, meaning on human rights issues broadly, on Hong Kong, on Tibet, on the status of Chinese human rights defenders, even when 50 UN human rights experts together called in 2020 for the establishment of a permanent mandate at the Human Rights Council, meaning somebody whose job it would be on an ongoing basis to monitor and report back on human rights abuses across China. There was not vocal support coming from the Secretary General's office. There has not been vocal support for, appointing the kind of investigative group that could have gotten the ball rolling, looking at serious abuses targeting Uyghurs a couple of years ago. The senior leadership of the UN seems deeply committed to avoiding confrontation with the Chinese government, to challenging them over serious human rights violations. And let's be clear, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights job, her function, that role, that mandate, is to defend victims, to help them find justice. And to fail to do that will really raise serious questions about her legacy. We cannot urge them strongly enough, and yet again, to release the report and put in motion the steps that are necessary to hold Chinese government officials accountable. Part of the reason we think that abuses have gotten so much worse since the 2008 games is that Chinese government officials do not fear accountability. And they're, in a way that's a logical conclusion to have reached. They have not been made to answer to any sort of justice for committing shocking human rights crimes. That has to change, or else, I can't even bear the thought of another Beijing Olympics, but let's imagine another 10 years down the track. If we look back 10 years and ahead 10 years, it's a pretty terrifying picture.
Thanks, Sophie. We're going to open the floor now to questions from journalists, and I want to go first to Michael from Swiss Public Radio, who is based in Shanghai. And Michael asks, who are the winners and losers of these games? How, in your view, have they played in favor of Beijing, considering how they've unrolled without major incident or contestation? And I think I'm going to go first here to Jahar for your analysis. Who have been the winners and the losers in these games? Thanks.
I really don't think there's a real winner or losers. What I do want to focus on that while hundreds of athletes are competing in this Olympics, there are hundreds of thousands of Uyghur families are torn apart and are suffering. And if we really have to put a term say that, can we really say that Uyghurs are the losers or China is the loser? Well, if we have to put a term, I would consider China as a loser because China wanted zero discussion on human rights during Olympics. But thank God people are discussing this. The reason we're having this press conference today is because we don't want the Chinese government to get what they want, having zero discussion during Olympics. We want to talk about this. And eventually, hopefully, the Chinese government will be the loser of this game of abusing innocent Uyghur children, families, and abusing their fundamental rights.
Thanks very much. Yacho, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes, I mean, when we talk about the Olympics, we mostly talk about how China is perceived outside of China. You know, the Beijing wants to showcase the country, the governance model to the world. But also, we shouldn't forget that the Communist Party also wants to showcase everything to the Chinese people. So this is a huge propaganda event within China. But what's very interesting in the past 2 weeks is that actually most people in China are not paying attention to the Olympics because their attention are all in one event, is in a remote village in Jiangsu province, because there was a case of a video that showed a woman who was chained around her neck in a shed, and she is a mother of 8 children, and people were suspected she was human trafficked into that village to, be forced into marrying a man who couldn't find a wife, because China now has a huge gender imbalance problem. China had the one-child policy for 30 years, which partly resulted in there were 30 million more men than women in China. So there were extensive human trafficking within China, also from women in countries around China were trafficked into China to be forced to be married to Chinese men that have children. So this has always been a big social issue. And then that video caught everybody's attention because this woman was so horrendously abused for all these years and produced 8 children. So then the government issued many contradictory statements about who this woman is. Where was she originally from? Where's the family? What's the relationship between her and the so-called husband? So everybody's attention is on this case because it really says, we don't care about this propaganda, whatever. We care about this woman, and because people feel connected to this woman because even you are middle-class woman, you can be walking on the street and you got knocked out, unconscious, and it can be trafficked to a rural village. So in a way, interestingly, that the Chinese government is a loser in this case because, it's a huge propaganda event. It wants to show that to the Chinese citizens, look, we produced this thing, but nobody cares about it because people are caring about some real social issues.
Yeah, I wanted to say that the question that you've just addressed is Eunice Yoon has asked about the life of Eileen Gu is being contrasted online to this victim of human trafficking who was chained in her home. She actually says that state media has started covering this story, and what do you make of that? And how important is it for the government to maintain this image of harmony? Thank you, Eunice. I was unaware that the state media was covering this case, although they may be covering it in a way that's favorable to the Chinese Communist Party. Yacho, do you want to elaborate?
Well, I think, it's still the abuse happened at the village level. So it shows the local government failed to investigate in the case. This woman was in the village for many years and nobody cared about her. It says the local government failed to protect the women's rights. So the reason the state media is started covering it, first of all, it concerns the top leadership. So anything about the top leadership is strictly prohibited. And if it's the failure of the local government, the state media, to extend the World Cup, can cover it. And I think it's also a response to just this uproar from people. People are so angry, because the local government kept issuing contradictory statements, like, this woman probably from that province, and people was like, you have this word, the state of art surveillance, like you boast about your surveillance every day, like you sell your surveillance around the world, like you can catch any criminals you can. How about just find out what's going on with this woman? So really, people are angry. I think, to an extent, the government has to address it. But that being said, I've been doing this job for 10 years. There are many these cases happened before. The state media can issue some statement. The police can issue such statement. Then the case closed. If you dare to keep investigating, you can be in trouble. We're talking about the Olympics in 2008. The Beijing Summer Olympics happened around the time the Sichuan earthquake happened. People want to know how many children died as a result of the shoddy constructions, the school constructions. Then people went there to investigate. They now get arrested and imprisoned. I mean, I'm sure, people like netizens will be silenced, whether they will be harassed or they get thrown into jail if they keep demanding the government to really disclose what happened. And not only what happened to this woman, it's also, who needs to be held accountable in the government for failing to protect that women. So we'll see, how the government will address this. But I don't have high hopes for, really getting deep down into, what happened and whether, officials needs to be responsible for this.
Thanks very much. And just a reminder that the Chinese government has signed on to all of the treaties to protect the basic human rights of women. We've seen in this case how difficult it is for women to access their human rights. I have a question from Ian Axon for Reuters. This is a question, I think, first to Rob or Noah. Have there been athletes who you've spoken to who have wanted to make a statement or to speak about human rights, but have felt too frightened to do so? And I'm recalling here that Niels van der Poel had said he was not going to speak out in China before he went to the games, and then he spoke out the minute he got back home to Sweden. Could you speak? And he also said, I'm not going to speak more because I have teammates still in country. Maybe first to Noah and then to Rob. Have you heard from Olympians or teammates, for Noah, former teammates who are concerned and afraid to speak out?
Yeah, I have spoken to multiple athletes who have told me that they want to speak out, they want to say something, and they have decided it's just not worth the risk. And they made this decision, they were getting asked about these issues long before the opening ceremony back in early January, in December, when they were first getting named to the team. Not only that, but team officials, at least in the US, were not letting journalists questions about human rights issues through to athletes. They said that we are trying to focus our team's energy on results and on our athletic performances. So athletes weren't even getting fielded these questions by journalists. So it was kind of a double whammy for athletes' speech. On the one hand, athletes were scared to speak out, especially after the threats from the organizing committee and the demonstration of the IOC's loyalty in their handling of the Peng Shuai case, right? The IOC in that case showed very clearly that they would be working with the Chinese Communist Party to silence an athlete who had spoken up to raise issues of abuse, as opposed to protecting the athlete. And so once we saw that, combined with the threat from the organizing committee, why would any athlete believe they would have been safe to speak up at these games? I'm really glad that Nils has spoken up as soon as he got home, and I hope that other athletes follow in his footsteps. I know from athletes, from my own experience, that it's really hard to criticize the organizing committee. In Sochi, we were up in this mountaintop village. It was this enclave built as a ski resort, a ski retreat spot for Putin. It had like 5 saunas in the village. We served amazing food. The venue was perfect. The volunteers were all friendly. I didn't speak up very much when I got home because I knew there were issues around those games, issues around worker rights and building the stadiums, issues around animal welfare in particular, issues around LGBTQ athletes. And yet I didn't say anything because it felt like insulting the host. It felt like these people had been so amazing to me. I'm so lucky to have been able to be here. I'm either very, excited about my results, or I'm really disappointed. But it feels wrong because it's so human to you as an athlete being at the games. And yet we sit here and we listen to Jahar's story, and we listen to Yachu talk about how the Chinese people haven't even focused on these games during them because there's been this other story of the abuse of a woman. And it puts it in context, and it says, look, the games were really incredible for you, and the experience was really good. But in the broader context, they have been used to further human rights abuses. They have been used to silence people. They have been used to elevate and to empower an authoritarian regime that is perpetrating these abuses. And so I really, really hope that athletes will follow in the footsteps of Nils. But that's a long answer to the question. The answer is yes, absolutely. There are athletes who have been scared to speak up, and I hope that fear will ease once they get home.
So a question to Rob. I actually want to, I know what the answer is, but I want to ask you. So there are a lot of reasons why athletes wouldn't speak up even after they get home. You mentioned briefly the power imbalance that these sports federations have. They control the lives of these athletes. They speak a little bit about whether or why athletes might not speak up, even if they did not have a good experience, or even if they felt bad about the human rights context of the games where they needed to compete.
Yeah, I mean, I think the International Olympic Committee sets a wonderful example for the National Olympic Committees. And that is that you do not have the right to speak up or speak against anything that we do or we do wrong. Look, the reality is this is not anecdotal. This is speaking with a lot of athletes. Just today, a specific group who is filing complaints against their national federations, who are afraid to speak up because retribution is real. And whether it's retribution of taking events away or spots on a team, it's everywhere. And athletes live in this area of fear and afraid to speak up. And not only that, they embed the fear into the parents, and that the parents now can't stand up and are afraid to stand up because their children won't get a spot on a team. So it's throughout the entire sport movement, and the examples set by the leaders, given that there's very limited human rights within the entire sport movement. I have a hard time to this day to understand how sport has the right to govern itself, and they think they're above the law, because any of these things happening outside of sport would be criminal. But yet sport seems to be able to find a way to walk away unscarred, do a report, and nothing happens. And my advice, which really came, and I'm so thankful to you and to Human Rights Watch, Minky, because we used to speak to athletes about what to do. And now the first thing is, before we talk about what we're going to do, I'm going to introduce you to someone. Her name is Mickey Warden, and they're going to tell you about human rights. They're going to tell you about your basic right to justice and everything you have the right to. And when you educate someone, something called empowerment happens. And I think that's what we're seeing now, the benefit of the human rights aspect and embedding it into the sport, because abuse is everywhere, it's rampant, and it needs to change.
Thanks very much, Rob. I think one of the things that we say quite a bit at Human Rights Watch is that athletes have human rights, and we shouldn't have to say that, but athletes don't sacrifice any of their rights to compete anywhere in the world. And I think that means their right to free speech, their rights as workers, their rights to be free from harassment and abuse, and powerful leaders taking away their right to speak. So we appreciate the solidarity of Global Athlete and so many other athletes groups who really have carved out this area of athletes' human rights. I'm going to get to a few more questions. I actually want to say a few words also about the work of journalists. Since we're holding a press conference, I watched the IOC press conference yesterday, and I was struck by the really important work that journalists have done in Beijing in what can only be described as a hazardous working environment, and the difficulty of constantly raising these issues that Jahar has raised of Uyghur forced labor, of family separation, mass internment, the problems of context of repression in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang, as well as Chinese human rights defenders. So I want to say a word of thanks to the journalists who've done such an essential job. You also are part of the Olympic system, and press freedom is one of the rights that we demand at Human Rights Watch. I'm going to come to Takashi Hamaguchi's question from Kyoto News. Hello, Takashi-san. How do you feel? His question is, how do you feel about the official character Bing Duen Duen? It successfully uses as a propaganda tool on SNS. And then whenever journalists try to ask about Xinjiang human rights abuses or Hong Kong human rights abuses in press conferences, the IOC and Beijing organizers are keeping focused on a positive story like yesterday's theme of volunteers and the power of sport, and they avoid answering questions. And I think Yacho would like to answer this one.
Well, I have a word to say about Bing Duen Duen, because this is like, it says so much about Chinese censorship, because Bing Duen Duen, the mascot has never been popular in the past several, Olympics. Everybody don't think the mascot works, but Bing Duen Duen has been so popular in China because there's so much propaganda surrounding it. But there's another incident I think it was several days ago. Bing Duen Duen was doing in a live stream at the state media broadcast. During a live stream, Bing Duen Duen started to talk, and it's a deep male voice. And this is so run contrary to the cute image of Bing Duen Duen. Then Chinese social media started to talk about why the Bing Duen Duen had this terrible voice. Interestingly, it's a non-issue, right? Like, Bing Duen Duen looks so cute, but now when he talks like a man, right? But the government censored the hashtag because the hashtag is Bing Duen Duen start to talk. That hashtag was censored. Then the live stream video, Bing Duen Duen talking in the voice was censored. It's a non-political issue. It says nothing, but the government has to censor it because it runs contrary to the perfect image, the perfect Olympic Games the government wants to portray. You can really see just the degree of censorship, the degree that the Chinese government tries to control the narrative.
So what I think you're saying is that Human Rights Watch is defending Bing Duen Duen's right to speak. Sophie?
Yacho can confirm, but what was the hashtag that was going around today? Was Bing Duen Duen has spoken?
Yeah, Bing Duen Duen has spoken. That's the hashtag that has been censored.
I'm desperate for a T-shirt that says Bing Duen Duen has spoken. But Takeshi-san, on the second half of your question, I really think that yesterday's press conference, in a way, told us everything that we needed to know about the players involved. I mean, here is IOC spokesman Mark Adams, not challenging Yan Jiarong's claim that there's no forced labor and that the allegations about arbitrary detention in Xinjiang is a lie. Right, Adams did not challenge Yan's remarks, but instead called the discussion surrounding Xinjiang, quote, not particularly relevant to the press conference or the IOC. Crimes against humanity are not relevant? I'm sorry. That's an appalling, ghastly statement to make, and it just tells you everything that you need to know about the IOC. And on the other hand, we watched Chinese government representatives at that press conference make unbelievably clear what everybody has known all along, which is about the profoundly political and politicized nature of these games and the Chinese government's absolute intention to use them as a justification for Xi Jinping's rule. And for a Beijing organizing committee spokesperson to have muscularly inserted a discussion about the one China policy in Taiwan into this press briefing, to have talked about denying human rights violations. I mean, people sort of joke about saying the quiet part out loud. I don't think the Chinese government has ever really been quiet about these things, but they said it really, really loudly yesterday. And that's the environment in which these games took place. And I think the IOC comes out just looking absurd and pathetic and like denialists, and the Chinese government looks like bullies.
I'd actually like to make another addition to that, which is to say the IOC has said consistently that the Olympics shouldn't be politicized, and they've used this as a way to deflect questions about crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, about forced labor in their own supply chain, about journalists being shoved out of their live shots when they're working outside of the national stadium, about Japanese journalist who was denied the right to work, to ask his question. And I think the broader, when we're reviewing the context of these games, I think that human rights are not political. They are operational requirements for all Olympics, and there is no successful Olympics where major human rights crimes or atrocity crimes are taking place. It sets a climate for athletes that is difficult, if not impossible, to work within. And especially, as Rob points out, so many of these athletes are very young. Some of them are still children when they are competing. And it is a hazardous working environment for athletes, for journalists, and for everyone who's part of the Olympic system. I'm going to come to our last question from Philip Barker. And Philip asks, in terms of the IOC's own legacy, would you like to see them enshrine human rights aspects in the requirements for future host cities hosting the Olympics, and how do they verify this? And I think I'll start. Actually, I'm going to ask everyone to answer that question while also summing up. But I'll also say, Rob Keeler, is this a never again moment for the Olympic movement? And how would you like to see, what would you like to see as a response to these games?
I mean, Mickey, we've been asking for this for years in terms of embedding human rights into the Olympic Charter, into the bid city documents. We've been asking for representation for athletes. We've been asking for equal rights. We've been asking for freedom of expression. I mean, we've been asking, and time again, we are having some success, but it's always forced. And athletes always have to fight instead of having a relationship to help grow sport, make it stronger, make it safer. So the simple answer is it has to happen yesterday to make sure that athlete rights are respected. And as you said, athletes, they're humans first, athletes second.
Noah, do you have anything to add to that as a recent Olympian, as someone who has friends in Beijing who I know been worried about?
Yeah, the thing that I've noticed, I retired in 2018, and Global Athlete was founded not long after, and I've been there since the beginning with Global Athlete, and the momentum for this accountability is building, and it's building fast. And the next 4 games that have been awarded summer and winter are going to Paris, Milan, LA, and then Brisbane. These are countries where the human rights issues surrounding them, there will of course be some, as Minky said, there's human rights abuses in every country, but they're not going to be front and center the way that they have been in Beijing. But that the issues surrounding the IOC, there is no relief for them. Athletes are not being paid to attend these games. Less than 5% of the revenue of the Olympic movement makes it all the way down to the athletes. Athletes have no rights to, still no rights to speak on the podium or on the field of play. Athletes are being abused, and abused specifically because they are athletes. We have seen this in Iran and Afghanistan and Belarus, and Olympic officials, sport administrators who are the ones providing this platform that is elevating athletes to these, places of prominence in society are taking no responsibility for athlete welfare. We continue to see the corruption of sport through state-sponsored doping. We continue to see completely ineffective arbitration system within sport, where the main party, the sport administrators, the party that is so often in front of the arbitration system is also the one that controls the arbitration system. Like, as Rob said, for things that don't make sense in a normal legal context, that is front and center, is the way that CAS is controlled by the IOC, and the vice president of the IOC is the president of CAS. You can't make this stuff up. It's crazy. So these issues for athletes are not going away. And regardless of where the games go next, IOC accountability is coming, because athletes are understanding how imperative it is that they hold the IOC accountable and have control over their sport and their careers, and how that's going to happen through independent professional representation and through the pressuring of other stakeholders, and namely the top sponsors, the main Olympic sponsors, and the broadcasters. They're the ones funding this movement. They're the ones who are making the whole thing happen. They're the ones who are literally funneling money into the IOC without any knowledge of how that money is being spent or where it's going, because it's completely opaque. Nobody knows exactly where all that money is going, and the responsibility of broadcasters and sponsors is clear, and the pressure is going to continue to be on them to hold the IOC accountable. So changes are coming, and these issues are staying front and center regardless of where the games go next.
Thanks, Noah, and also for being such a powerful voice for change. Sophie, Noah raised the question of sponsors and broadcasters. NBC is responsible for more than 40% of the revenues that the IOC is using. And sponsors themselves pay billions for the underwriting privileges of the games. Do they have any responsibility for how these Olympics have turned out?
Well, I don't think they have a responsibility necessarily for how the games have turned out. They certainly have responsibility for not having done the kind of human rights due diligence that's expected of them under the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights. And, some of these companies, I think, will be facing some challenges once the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act becomes law. For companies that are importing into the US will have to prove that the goods they're bringing in were not made with forced labor. We're seeing in the same way that Noah is talking about accountability for the IOC and, making, concrete, specific, verifiable commitments. We're starting to see a push for that around corporate engagement in China too. And I think that's the right way to go, because for 30 years the argument has been that to open up will bring to open up economically will bring some political reform. I think we have seen pretty clearly that is not the way the causal arrow runs, and there's growing pressure on businesses to not be complicit in abuses themselves. And I think that's a very important and potentially transformative step. There are a lot of other industries and sectors that aren't yet touched by this kind of legislation. We talk a lot about, tech companies, media companies, maybe complicit in censorship and these kinds of things. So more work needs to be done in those areas. But I think that the idea of accountability is growing.
Thanks very much. So everyone should watch that space. Jahar, Sophie mentioned the challenges that are coming on the horizon. I remember in December, the House and the Senate rapidly passed the End Uyghur Forced Labor the Prevention Act, and then it was signed into law at the end of December. And does this feel like a watershed to you, a moment where companies are really, they're going to have to affirmatively prove they don't have forced labor in their supply chains? it's the IOC actually reported for the first time on its own supply chains to attempt to say that it was free from forced labor, when, as you said, it was not a comprehensive or transparent process. What do you think is next? And just to go to Philip's question, what would you like to see? You know, you and Yacho have been through 2 Olympics in China. What would you like to see for human rights in the future in China, but also for the Olympic system that has enabled such a massive propaganda spectacle?
It's a great question, Minky. When the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed, I was jumping on my mattress for 5 minutes because I was just happy. And I know many Uyghurs in the diaspora shared the same moment. They probably jumped somewhere else, but it was a very unique moment because businesses, US corporations will finally be held accountable for their complicity in Uyghur forced labor, finally. But for that to really be happen, we will need vital and swift, and it will be very vital to have swift and vigorous enforcement of this law, because without a strong enforcement, then it's just another piece of paper, just like previous laws on forced labor. Because in the past, in the US constitutional law, there already been legislation regarding on forced labor, but forced labor tinted goods were still being imported into the country. That is why it is so crucial to have a really active enforcement of this bill. And we know that it's going to take about 180 days for the CBP to really enact this bill. And I want to note that for people who are not aware, by March 10th, organizations still have the opportunity to leave their comments and suggestions at the CBP website for them to suggesting how they can better enforce this law. So I really call on journalists who are listening to this to emphasize the importance of how important this commenting period is. And the next step, yes, it's indeed to enforcement of this law. And US should not be the only country that has such laws being passed. We also need UK, Canada, Australia, France and Italy and other European countries to do the same. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that those goods that are banned from the US border are going to be shipped to turn a direction and be shipped to Canada, and shipped to Italy, shipped to other countries. What also might happen is that they could be shipped to other countries, and then they're going to put on another label saying made in France, made in Canada, made in UK, and then being re-enter the US market because they have washed down their made of Uyghur forced labor label from visible label. So it really it should not be a single effort. It should be a unified effort. And this is really, the Chinese government always calls on unification on this, unification on that. 团结就是力量. It's a word, it's a sentence that Chinese government uses so often. It's like unification is the power. And this is the time we need to gather this power in order to combat forced labor. We need to unify in this front, and then we need more countries to pass similar bills and legislations, and to have better due diligence laws as well. And especially EU, EU is at high risk of being the second safe haven for the Chinese government's goods to be entered in their market.
Thank you, Jahar. Yacho, do you think that more people know about the problem of forced labor from the Uyghur region in China because of the Olympics? Do you think that more people are aware of this ghastly story of the woman who was chained? Has the Olympics been the propaganda success that the Chinese Communist Party was looking for at home and abroad?
Well, I would be short. I mean, this Olympics, really brings attention to human rights issues in China, because just by, what I got, the media requests I got over the past, months, and I really hope that, the attention of human rights violations in China will not go away when the Olympic ends. I hope journalists will continue to cover China. One last message I want to say, the Chinese government tried so hard to control the narrative, so much money poured into the propaganda, the facility, the infrastructure. But eventually, the Bing Dun Dun is an example that they didn't manage Bing Dun Dun well. Bing Dun Dun talk, right? Also, Chinese people's attention were driven away from the event to a woman who's being chained around the neck in the village. So the government tried hard, but it still, to an extent, it failed succeeding in propagating the game. So, I wanted the international attention to keep on China's human rights violations. And the last message I want to say that, people care about real issues, and the government tries harder to suppress the voices, and people are still talking.
So I want to say a big thank you to everyone who joined us. And I think we're actually speaking just ahead of the International Olympic Committee press conference at 11. So I do want to encourage any journalists who are actually going from our press conference to the International Olympic Committee to really ask these hard questions that you've heard from Jahar, a Uyghur whose father, who's not seen her father in many years, and he's in life imprisonment, from Yacho, who shared the story, the stories that the Chinese government doesn't want you to hear. They're in our new statement. From Noah, from Rob, and from Sophie. And I just wanted to say that I have put in the chat a reminder that the Beijing Olympics are not the only major sporting event that is affiliated with very serious human rights abuses. Later this year, the World Cup will take place in Qatar, and with very serious labor rights violations, preventable deaths, no LGBT rights, male guardianship system, and restricted press freedom. And I would also say that the Paralympics will happen in a few weeks in China, and that people really should not shift their lens from the abuses in China, and that we should also really monitor athletes' rights in that setting as well. So please, thank you all for joining today, and please do keep the spotlight on human rights abuses in China. Human Rights Watch will certainly continue to do so. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Minky.
Just to say a quick thank you. Judy, are we still broadcasting?
No, hang on. I have stopped it.
It's
Thanks,
still
Minky.
live on YouTube.